Hello, I am Ángeles Mendoza. In the previous lecture, we reviewed the theory and application of ecosystem services. In this lecture, I will focus on ecosystem services assessment, a modality of environmental impact assessment that focuses on how development might affect the services that sustain people and the environment. We will review what ecosystem services is, the main steps, and the importance that it has to communicate the relevance of Eflows for human well-being. We'll also review some of the tools that are available for ecosystem services assessment. To begin, let's review some concepts. Beneficiaries are individuals, people, or organizations that benefit from ecosystem services. Supply is how much of a given service is provided by an ecosystem. Demand is how much of that service or product is used by people. Impacts are the negative effects of projects, plans, policies, programs, or laws on the capacity of ecosystems to provide services, or on the quality of the services that might affect their use or meaning for beneficiaries. Dependencies are the reliances of individuals, communities, or organizations on ecosystem services for subsistence, for economy, or for any other purpose. Ecosystem Services Assessment, or ESA, is a modality of environmental impact assessment. It is an ecosystem-based approach to assess the impacts and benefits of human interventions on the environment and people. It follows the basic steps of the environmental impact assessment process. Here I summarize them in three: identify project activities, identify how they affect the environment, and design mitigations that, in the case of Eflows, should be focused on maintaining the levels of water that will sustain services for the ecosystems, but also for people. A key point of ESA is to evaluate the significance of changes in the supply of ecosystem services. We use different criteria to determine the significance: the existing supply, the existing demand, how much people are using, what is the trend on that supply or demand, how it is changing, is increasing or decreasing, what is the dependency of beneficiaries on that service, what ability beneficiaries have to replace that service, how that service contributes to alleviate poverty or reduce vulnerability, and also are the changes resulting in access to that service for different groups. So in summary, significance is determined by the magnitude of the change, the influence on well-being. And all this is based on the values that people give to those services. The precautionary principle is very important when assessing ecosystem services. It means that the lack of evidence should not prevent action to avoid impacts on ecosystem services, especially if they cannot be reversed or compensated, if those impacts will bring ecosystems near situations where they could decline or could affect their resiliency. And also, it suggests that actions are needed if the impacts could be significant on sensitive species, endangered species, critical processes, or on particular species, and also in cases where there are no known mitigations. So we can consider Eflows in impact assessment at different levels. We start at project level. When we assess how a project would affect ecosystem services, we try to identify those activities that could result in changes on water levels, and that in turn will result in impacts on ecosystem services that could affect the well-being of people. Environmental impact assessment is the tool used at this level. When we had plans, policies, or laws that also could influence ecosystem services, we would use Strategic Environmental Assessment, or SEA. At the level of plans, a key point could be to identify what cumulative effects could affect water bodies and ecosystem services, but also what policies or laws, when implemented, could induce impacts on ecosystem services. This table summarizes some points that are important in ecosystem services assessment, especially when it's used at the strategic level. First, consideration of ecosystem services must have in the design phase to take proactive actions to prevent impacts. Talking about ecosystem services can give a common language that different stakeholders can understand, and then might result in their support for conservation. The assessment needs to be relevant for decision making, and that means not use only science, but understand how the findings can be translated into the local language, the local understanding, or in general, the language that regulators and proponents could understand. It's also important to remember that the scale influences the assessment, because when we analyze impacts at regional level, we might overlook impacts at local level that are also very important for local people. And in the assessment, the most important thing is to communicate the trade-offs and synergies that might happen, because the improvement in one service might represent the decline in other service. Another point is to remember that sometimes we don't need to have all the information or all the numbers to inform decision makers and the public. In some fields, there is the emphasis to try to put a value or a money price to ecosystem services, but that requires lots of information that often is not available. So what we need is to communicate people what would happen if we change the condition of the environment, and then the relation of that change with the services that people need for survival, or even that economy needs to keep steady or to grow. An example of this could be the availability of water. When we change a river, we affect other uses, both upstream and downstream, and that reflects on services that might be gained or lost. Later in the course, you will learn different methodologies to estimate Eflows. In this section, I want to present you some of the tools that are available online free of charge and that are useful to assess ecosystem services and also communicate their importance to different stakeholders. Before I mentioned that sometimes we don't need to have all the information. And this is one of the situations that Values takes advantage of. Values is a methodology developed by the German government. The purpose of Values methodology is to integrate ecosystem services into plans, programs, and projects. It is a participatory tool. That means that whether there is data or not, the important is to bring together all the different stakeholders so they can understand how a proposed intervention might affect the services that are provided and what groups could be benefit or impacted by that. So the purpose is to inform people so they can dialogue and negotiate. The website here provides information on what each one of the steps involves, but also has valuable links to other information like other methodologies to assess ecosystem services, tools, even tools to quantify or evaluate, and case studies. I suggest you to check this website. Sectoral organizations are also considering ecosystem services. The Global Oil and Gas Industry Association for Environmental and Social Issues, IPECA, has created a guidance for ecosystem services. It is based on checklists and focuses on minimizing business risks. It considers 4 steps. The first one is to select the checklist that applies depending on the phase of the project, the type of the habitat. Then, to identify how the different activities will affect the dependency of the project or will result in impacts. Based on that, companies can identify risks and opportunities to promote collaboration. It could be to reduce impacts or to find ways to mitigate that could be acceptable for everybody. These mitigations can also include alternatives to improve the condition of ecosystem services in other areas. Those are called enhancement measures. In the guide, you will find tables that will inform what kind of impacts might be expected depending on the specific activities that will be carried out. The tables also list examples of risks that might be attached, opportunities that companies can use to engage with stakeholders, and suggestions for specific mitigation measures. The Corporate Ecosystem Services Review, created by the World Resources Institute, also focuses on identifying business risks for companies. The guide follows the basic steps of the impact assessment process. So, in scope, determine what will be included in the assessment, for instance, identifying the services that might be affected. Then in the analysis phase, prioritize what services are more important to include in the assessment because of the dependencies of people. Analyze the trends in the supply and demand on those services, but also establishing the baseline So how much is there, and then how it could be affected by the operations. By assessing the impacts and dependencies that might be changed because of the project, then the final step is to identify mitigations, either to manage the demand, for instance, reduce the demand or increase the supply, or to compensate in the case of losses. This guide might lead to a qualitative assessment if there are no data available, but if there are, they can be used to inform the decisions. Based on the list of ecosystem services provided by the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, companies can analyze the dependencies of beneficiaries and of their projects on ecosystem services and how the different activities will result in impacts. It's also based on determining the priority ecosystem services and provide mitigations to either avoid those impacts, reduce them, or compensate them if it's not possible to remediate. If you like models and numbers, then the Natural Capital Project tool is for you. The Stanford University, through the Natural Capital Project, has been developing different models to quantify the ecosystem services, and these models integrate INVEST, which means Integrated Valuation of Ecosystem Services and Trade-offs. This tool is free. You can download all the software from the website, and right now they have 18 models that cover terrestrial ecosystems, freshwater, marine, and coastal areas. The models can be used independently or can be combined, but it's very data intensive, so sometimes the models might be good, but if there are no data, you might not be able to use them. It's a GIS tool, so you will need a software like ArcGIS or QGIS to analyze data and view the results. This is the list of the models that are available right now. Some apply to supporting services like habitat quality or abundance of pollinators, important for food. Others refer to final ecosystem services like carbon storage. I highlighted here water yield for reservoir hydropower. This model directly applies to Eflows because it considers how maintaining different Eflows could result in losses in the production of electricity. So it's a model that you might be able to check if you go to the website. Besides the models, Natural Capital also includes supporting tools that allow the overlay of different layers of information, tools to generate digital elevation models, or to design different scenarios to evaluate alternatives. Valuation is an important but controversial part of ecosystem services assessment. Valuation tries to find the monetary worth of services. This slide presents some of the methods available. The website contains useful information. The value of a service often is relative, depends on the personal and cultural non-monetary values that people give to different components of the ecosystem. Valuation is useful in several cases. For example, to account for natural capital. In natural capital accounts, which are a way to evaluate the effectiveness of environmental policy and law. Valuation also can help set a reference value to negotiate compensation for the loss of ecosystem services. However, valuation methods focus mostly on provisional services and market value, so are unable to capture the tangible and intangible values of ecosystem services. Many people consider unethical or inappropriate to try to give a monetary value to services that are considered invaluable. For example, those that relate to the culture and spirituality of different indigenous groups. An indigenous man from the Caribbean gave me an example. For some people, a fish from the river can be replaced with canned fish from the supermarket. For an indigenous person, that might fill the stomach, but will never fill the spiritual void of losing the river and losing the ability to teach children how to fish and pass them the stories that make the river an intrinsic part of the individual and the community. Take-home messages. Ecosystem services assessment is a tool to identify how different interventions can affect water levels, aquatic ecosystems, and the services that they provide. Ecosystem services can be integrated into environmental and strategic impact assessment to assess the impacts of specific projects and identify mitigations that will ensure the maintenance of Eflows. Valuation is one aspect of ecosystem services assessment, but that's only part of it. The main purpose is to help all parties understand the trade-offs that will result from modifying aquatic ecosystems. This will support decisions to prevent the negative consequences of interventions on people and the environment. Remember to check the references available at eCampus. Thank you for listening to this presentation.